Welcome to Mystara for the second remaster of the Creature Crucible line. This time heading straight up with the book top Ballista, the one with the Flying City, and the biplanes, and the Gnomes, and all the weirdness that was peak TSR silly phase. While not as popular as its predecessor, Tall Tales of the Wee Folk, Top Ballista gave us Serraine, one of the most definitive locations in all of Mystara. It also wrecked a fair number of campaigns because suddenly everybody wanted Magitech fighters and similar, and this was the book that laid out how. I'm Mr. Welch. It's time to secure your trays in the upright position. We're headed to Serraine. Top Ballista was the work of the timeless Carl Sargent, one of the best RPG designers of his time. The art is very Jim Holloway, so that tells you this is going to be humorous throughout. The book was released in '89 and followed the same format as the Crucibles, with a 64-page source book and a 32-page adventure book. It's a bit skimpy on the playable races this time around, with only 8, making it one of the Crucibles with the fewest races. As you've probably already figured it out, all the races are aerial in nature or dealing with Magitech. The story behind Serraine goes all the way back to Blackmoor, and actually cemented part of Mystara lore by giving our gnomes an actual identity. Back in the 80s, all gnomes were turning into mad scientists that made up for enthusiasm what they lacked in competence. Tinker gnomes made all sorts of weird devices that were far more complicated than they needed to be, and rarely worked as intended. Then Mystara introduced us to Jimreen Jimai, a gnomish artisan that found a ship's jet engine that he identified as a thrust drive, utilizing artificial reverse gravity to function, and decided he was going to fix that. Remember the last 2 attempts to fix a Blackmoor device after the Great Rain of Fire? Ended with a lot of hot fusion death and giant nationwide deadlands in the forms of the Broken Lands and the Land of Black Sand. But Jimreen not only figured out what he had, he figured out how to repair it. There might have been some immortal assistance, but he still managed to repair a city-long jet engine made of explodium in a world where the next largest Blackmoor device that still functioned properly was a pistol. The gnomes started designing a city around this engine in 150 BC, when they found a huge source of information from an unlikely source. A human sage calling himself Wretchfoot provided them with all sorts of knowledge about Blackmoor devices that could only come from first-hand experience. Turns out Wretchfoot wasn't a human, he was a Nagpa. Not one of those imposters serving the Morgan cosplayer calling herself the Raven Queen, but an actual Nagpa. The one that are cursed to never know happiness, joy, or even satisfaction. You know, like a Seattle Mariners fan. Wretchfoot was from the time of Blackmoor, and as part of his curse, every time he was killed, he was immediately reborn back into his original body. So while all the humans in Blackmoor got turned to ash, Wretchfoot saw a bright light, searing pain, and then discovered he had to go back through puberty. Again. Still, helping the gnomes gave him something to do. The next bit of help came from a pair of sphinxes who were the biggest collectors of Blackmorabilia in all of Mystara around 91 BC. The gnomes were still in the testing phase of getting the city off the ground, but the sphinxes had information and devices that saw the initial attempts at flight suddenly become plausible. This book has a lot of Blackmoor-related creatures, devices, and artifacts, probably more than the rest of the setting combined. While Blackmoor is quite off limits per the Immortals, at least here it made for an interesting story. If you're combining Disneyland with a shield helicarrier, you might as well go all in. The rest of the city's design was assisted by other creatures in later years. The Fanair that would settle in Serraine agreed to help in exchange for the gnomes sheltering them from an unnamed foe. They used their magic to summon air elementals that would help stabilize the city and power parts of the drive system. Pegatars were hired to provide security and short-range defense against any attackers. Finally, on the 1st of Ambermont in 39 AC, Serraine took off with 1,100 gnomes and quite a few of the races that helped them get to the monumentous day. The gnomes were giddy when the city reached its cruising altitude, and then astonished when they found out that everything worked according to plan. And the city has been aloft for nearly 1,000 years without any serious incident. The city immediately did have its problems. Because of its relatively small size compared to its population, it couldn't feed itself well. It was able to land, but this was dangerous and usually left a Serraine-sized impression on the ground. The gnomes were also looking for a means of self-defense. They found mounted creatures to be too difficult to be feasible, so created flying craft that could defend the city, as well as larger cargo planes that could resupply the city. Then they took off around the planet, showing off what they made, and probably spammed their Kryn cousins with postcards to rub it in. Because that's what I would do. Now you're on this giant gnomish city, cruising around doing your own thing, but you still have to make a living. Why not make it a tourist trap? But in Fantasy Mystara, tourist traps come to you. Serraine has a thriving market for people wanting to visit and spend their money there. They have high-end shops, an actual amusement park, luxury hotels, possibly the most comprehensive arcane library in the world, and numerous museums of various gnomish inventions. The city tends to keep to a scheduled route, though it avoids certain nations who have eyes on it like Thyatis or Glantry. When it reaches its destination, the city will circle the area while the clipper planes ferry people and cargo to and from Serraine. The most obvious part of the city for the visitors will be the airport, including the long runway used by all the craft. It stands mostly free from the city and is lined with multiple hangars, as well as the customs terminal that all visitors will have to spend hours getting processed through. The plains are a huge tourist draw, but outside of sightseeing tours, most guests aren't allowed anywhere near the vehicles for fear of industrial espionage. There's a lot of wizards that would pay handsomely for an actual Serraine vehicle, or just the plans for one if possible. The bars that are frequented by the pilots are surprisingly unwelcome to tourists. It's not just the fact that everything is gnome-sized. The pilots form a brotherhood, something ground pounders would never understand. Of course, being a Creature Crucible, your players are going to want to see what creatures have been opened up for them. Fair warning, like Tall Tales, Top Ballista has several creatures with negative experience, meaning you start off at a negative and have to earn XP to get all the creature's normal abilities. And Top Ballista's negative levels are almost punitive. The vaults have some articles that rebalance the negative issues. I'd recommend you look for those before you realize the equivalent of a first level Sphinx XP-wise is a 27th level fighter. You will start with 2d8 hit points, but before you get another die, the fighter has already leveled up 8 times. It's a huge complaint about the monster races presented, and a fair one at that. First up among the races is obviously the Gnomes. They are by far the most populous, and the book splits them into 2 versions, the Hill Gnomes and the Sky Gnomes. Hard to believe it, but these are the first playable gnomes in Mystara, some 8 years after the first books came out. The ground gnomes are a bit boring, sharing several abilities with dwarves. They gain new abilities as they level up, and are just as adept at building things as their Sky Gnome cousins. They get Earth-related special rules, while the Sky Gnomes get Air-related special rules. This includes the ability to speak with burrowing creatures from the start, including badgers, moles, armadillos, and West Virginians. The most important feature to the gnomes from Mystara comes at 9th level for both the sky and the ground varieties, and that's the meddling feature. In short, it gives a bonus to a gnome's ability to design giant Magitech devices. Once the device is complete, rather than rolling to see if the construction is successful like they do with Glantrian or Alphasian creations, the gnomish inventions automatically work. They still have to pay for it. Building a 1,200-foot tall giant robot like Earthshaker is going to take decades to construct just from all the resources required. But once it's done, it powers up no problem. The gnomes have a general idea of how this ability works. The ideas just come to them. Fortunately, the cost of building large Magitech devices is prohibitive, but there's a reason why gnomish devices are above and beyond anything the other races can even imagine. The next race found on Serraine is the Fenrir, which despite having a huge section about them in the book, and featured in several adventures, have no art whatsoever. Best description of them are bird elves. They have feathered features, are slim and lithe, and while they can't grab anything heavy with their hands, their feet are dexterous enough to fight with weapons and similar. As you can expect, they can't carry anything heavy and still fly. They have a strange protection from birds ability, are only surprised on a roll of 1 on a d12, and have the equivalent of protection from lightning early on. They also have 2 negative levels before you reach adulthood. Their biggest feature is their song magic, and it comes with custom spells using the wisdom stat for prime requisite. These spells are unique to the Fenrir, and there's a relatively small number of them. Fenrir are naturally curious, distrustful of others, but also fun-loving, especially in open air. Unfortunately, they're never mentioned again outside of this book as far as I could find. Gremlins are a common problem in Serraine, and a playable race as well. They aren't a popular race in a lot of campaigns due to the fact that many of their abilities deal with breaking down mechanical devices, and most of their other abilities are designed to mess with people's rolls. They have the reputations of being only played by trolls, the players, not the creatures. Due to their primary abilities being tied to messing up devices, outside of Serraine, you're going to find that they are over-specialized. The book even warns DMs that gremlins are not good fits in most parties because of their anarchistic nature. Most of their abilities involve destroying things, adding penalties to skill rolls, saving throws, and similar tests. They also get several other abilities to make everyone's life miserable, so maybe they aren't the best for player characters. Moving on to the next creature, it's the Harpy. Harpies come in 2 varieties, the evil monster Harpies and the utterly indifferent player character Harpies. They start with 2 negative levels, but they have the ability for limited flight. By limited flight, they can fly a number of hours equal to their hit dice a day. And they can fly a long time, just not all day. The rest of their abilities is pretty restricted to just their charm power. The higher level they get, the more powerful the charm becomes. Unlike other races, they don't get a lot of background. If you want to play a feathered naked woman, fly, and like charming people, there's the Harpy. Next up is the Nagpa, for the people that watched Dark Crystal and said, hey, I want to be the bad guy. They are depressed, usually evil, and thoroughly miserable creatures. They're also natural spellcasters, but only start with a few middling spells like Darkness and Paralysis, and have a staggering -5 levels, requiring over 1,000,000 XP to get to level 0. They have no combat abilities, they get few hit points, their natural magic sucks, and they can't be wizards or clerics like other races, despite the claim that they are highly magical creatures. They learn new spells every level, but they're going to be dwarfed in power by everyone else who can learn spells. It's hard to play this race and expect to have fun while everyone is lapping you, while you're just trying to get the normal powers that the monster is known for. Pegatars are the protectors of Serraine. Take a Pegasus, add an elf torso, and you've got a Pegatar. They're awesome, and they know it. So will you, because they will constantly remind you of how awesome they are. These guys are so vain, elves think they're stuck up. They're normally fighters, but they can take spellcasting levels with the right stats. They fly around, they fight people, and are harder to work into dungeon crawls than centaurs. They've got 3 negative levels, so dying early is a problem, naturally. They tend to fall into the awesome but impractical category for players. Now we come to possibly the most unplayable creature in all of BECMI, or even D&D, the Sphinx. On paper, it sounds awesome. Spell immunity, flying, a magical roar, protection from normal weapons. And then you realize you are a staggering negative 10 levels behind everyone else. You are 300,000 XP away from the next negative level, and you're starting at 3 million XP in the hole. By the time you are ready to move up from doing just 1d2, 1d2, 1d6 damage with no chance at hitting anything that requires a magical weapon to hit it, the fighter is being knighted in Norwald. The Sphinx is so unplayable that on the Vaults of Pandius there's an article rebalancing the level system so you can actually play one. I don't think the races of Top Ballista got a lot of playtesting. Many of the more powerful creatures aren't very powerful at all, and have to go on an adventure for quite a while before they can withstand a sleep spell or don't die to a random fireball. Lastly, there's the Tabby. Okay, it's the flying monkey from Wizard of Oz. Doesn't even try to hide it. They can't wear armor. They can't use weapons. They have claws that deal d4 damage and require a saving throw versus poison, or the target becomes diluted. A diluted creature will then attack the nearest creature, which is usually the Tabby anyways, because they have short little arms. They do get several thief skills, and a fair bit of natural magic as they level up. Of course, they get negative levels, but only 3 this time, but it still starts them at negative 32,000 with 8,000 required before you get your next hit die. They wouldn't be half bad as characters except for their glacial advancements charts. The race section in Top Ballista is pretty lacking, I'm not going to lie. Most of the creatures are mechanically broken, not in the overpowered way. It's obvious to most players they aren't even good for playing one on a lark. I can only speculate that they weren't playtested much, but if you're going to allow them, the DM will need to rebalance their XP charts so they can at least keep up with the rest of the party. Remember, some, especially the Nagpa, don't get anything to make them on par with the regular races. Nobody liked the ECL equivalents in 3rd edition, and its predecessor in BECMI wasn't any better. But while the races weren't much to look at, the setting itself sells the book and is one of the most interesting cities in D&D. Serraine has 2 halves, the upper city where the tourists hang out and most of the business takes place, and the lower city with all the machinery, where most of the citizens live. The gnome-sized citizens. The larger races live on the surface. The Undercity is built for the gnomes, who prefer living underground, even miles above the actual ground. The Undercity is a maze, but you will find shops, bars, homes, and even several floors of the library. All of them gnome-sized, which makes exploring the Undercity difficult for most races. Above ground, the city is more than just a tourist attraction. It's a major source of arcane lore. The Great Library contains every manner of knowledge from across the planet. When the city stops at a location, several librarians make it a point to grab any books or similar they find as useful additions and return them to Serraine. The library has countless books, scrolls, magical recording devices, thought crystals that project the knowledge directly into your brain, and even programmed illusions for a visual medium. The librarians are famous for knowing exactly where everything is and can find a book in mere minutes. The Head Librarian is one of the most colorful characters in the city, being a Druge, a type of floating skull spirit, named Matazumi. His kind are normally chaotic evil, and while he was captured and geshed into protecting the library, he has softened over the years as he actually enjoys this job. It doesn't make him any nicer, and remember, if you steal a book, he is allowed to use lethal force. The city has a large number of hotels, and while they are of varying price, the quality on all of them is top-notch. Serraine prides itself on its amenities. Any hotel that gets run down gets shut down. Staying in Serraine, as you can imagine, is expensive, and the poorer tourists that are brought here by the gnomes as part of special deals made with local lords can only stay for a day before having to return. Food prices are always high because of the need to acquire them from the surface, and the hotels charge several times normal rates for their rooms because of the limited supply. If your players have a lot of money and you need to get rid of it, a vacation in Serraine is a very fast way to empty their pockets. One thing the players will notice as they approach the city is the formidable defenses. Serraine has to defend itself against dragons, so they're sporting some heavy firepower. The first wave of defense is their biplanes, armed with magical guns as well as ballistas or alchemical devices. The city has quite a few magical guns surrounding the city called Akak guns, after the late human mage Akak Kowalski, who invented them. I'm not really sure about his name, but he kind of did look like a Kowalski. The Akak part is canon. If you wanted to keep with the Magitech theme and get away from gnomes firing catapults and ballistas at dragons from a flying city, grab some inventions from the Wondrous Inventions book. Miniature death engines, which are basically steam-powered chain guns, more than fit the bill and don't look out of place at all. If you're a DM, work up how suicidal it would be to try to assault the city from the air. Like how if the Alphasians attacked with their airships, Serraine would blow half the fleet out of the sky before the Alphasians were even in range. Gnomish Magitech reigns supreme in Mystara, something that Top Ballista hammers home. Obviously, the Magitech is the first thing everybody notices about visiting Serraine. When you're a D&D product and the cover art is two goblins in a biplane about to have a talk with a red dragon, it's impossible not to notice. The book has rules for multiple types of fighters and rules for vehicular combat. The rules for creating Magitech devices are found in other books like Dawn of the Emperors or the Book of Wonders and Inventions, but Top Ballista finally explains why the gnomes are so much better at making them. They can build anything. The only restriction is the price and the components involved. You want to build a 120-story tall robot? Not a problem. What about a drill big enough to reach the hollow world? Call a gnome. The Immortals probably have multiple gnomish inventions on standby to deal with extraplanar breaches by spelljammers. What if you're a newly landed noble in Norwald and you find out that there's kobolds massing to invade your nation? Try out the gnomish specialty. An RX intercontinental radar sneaky multi-warheaded nuclear missile. The gnomes cater to all sorts here. Top Ballista is a real mixed bag of the book, with far more positive than negative. The races range from amusing and useful to completely unfeasible due to weak abilities or ridiculous XP requirements. The book breaks down aerial combat for several pages that I didn't cover, because it's just a lot of rules. But if you're going to have a dogfight with a dragon, this book has 6 pages on how to do it. It covers everything from basic combat to what happens when control rolls go really badly. Things like flat spins, aka the Goose Killer. The information on the city is what most people remember about the book. Sure, a lot of people only recall the amusement park, but there is so much more to Serraine and quite a few locations and characters that escape the silly phase to be actually interesting or even threats. If you want a copy of Top Ballista, there's a PDF for $5 on the Guild, but there's no POD version yet. I've seen copies go for about $30 to $40 online, with sealed versions costing over $100. Finding one with a map can be tricky, but the book isn't in that much of demand, so just be patient. That's 2 Creature Crucibles down, and 2 to go. Next one up is the Sea People, or the Underwater Races, which has even less useful creatures. Still, it opens up several new races and a lot more Mystara lore. But remember, until then, it's all fun and games until the clouds start speaking gnomish.